Sarah Thompson stood at the kitchen window of her small cabin, watching the endless prairie grass sway in the morning breeze. The year was 1876, and life on the frontier was hard for everyone, but especially for women who had nowhere to turn when their world fell apart. At 24 years old, Sarah had already lived through more heartbreak than most people twice her age. She had married Thomas Brennan 3 years earlier in Ohio, believing his promises of a better life out west. Thomas was a charming man with bright blue eyes and a smile that could convince anyone of anything. He told her about the fertile land waiting in Colorado territory, about the fortune they would make together, about the family they would raise under the big western sky. Sarah believed every word because she wanted to believe. Her parents had died of fever the year before, leaving her alone with nothing but a few belongings and her trust in the man who promised to take care of her forever. The journey west had been brutal. They traveled for months in a covered wagon with 3 other families, facing scorching heat during the day and bitter cold at night. Sarah watched 2 children die of sickness along the way, their tiny graves marked only by piles of stones on the endless plain. She saw grown men cry when their oxen died, leaving them stranded until other travelers could help. Through it all, Thomas remained cheerful and optimistic, always talking about their bright future ahead. When they finally reached their destination in eastern Colorado, Sarah felt her heart sink. The land Thomas had bought sight unseen was nothing like he had described. Instead of rich, fertile soil, they found hard-packed earth that seemed to reject every seed they planted. The small creek Thomas had been promised was nothing more than a trickle that dried up completely by midsummer. Their nearest neighbors were 15 miles away, and the closest town was a day's ride on horseback. But Sarah was determined to make the best of it. She worked alongside Thomas from dawn to dusk, trying to coax crops from the stubborn ground. She learned to preserve what little food they could grow, to mend clothes until they fell apart completely, to stretch every penny until it screamed. When winter came, they huddled together in their tiny cabin, burning dried grass and buffalo chips to stay warm, while the wind howled outside like a hungry wolf. Thomas began to change during that first terrible winter. The cheerful, optimistic man Sarah had married gradually disappeared, replaced by someone bitter and angry. He started drinking heavily, trading precious supplies for whiskey from passing traders. When the whiskey ran out, he would rage at Sarah as if their failures were all her fault. He blamed her for not being strong enough, for not working hard enough, for not being the kind of wife who could make their desperate situation better through sheer force of will. By the second year, Thomas had stopped working their land altogether. He would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was looking for work or better opportunities. But Sarah knew he was just running away from their problems. She continued to tend their struggling garden alone, hauling water from the distant creek in heavy buckets, fighting off rabbits and prairie dogs that wanted to eat their meager crops. Her hands became rough and scarred, her face burned brown by the relentless sun, her body thin from too little food and too much work. The loneliness was almost unbearable. Sometimes Sarah would go weeks without seeing another human face besides Thomas, and his company had become more burden than comfort. She talked to herself just to hear a friendly voice, sang old songs from her childhood to fill the terrible silence that surrounded their cabin like a living thing. At night, she would lie awake listening to the coyotes howl in the distance and wonder what would become of her if she couldn't make this life work. When Thomas was home, he grew increasingly cruel. He mocked her appearance, telling her she looked like an old woman at 25. He complained about her cooking, even though she was doing miracles with the few ingredients they had. He began hitting her during his drunken rages, first just slaps that he would apologize for the next morning, then harder blows that left bruises on her arms and ribs. Sarah had nowhere to go and no money to leave, so she endured it all and hoped things would somehow get better. The third year brought a drought that withered what little remained of their hopes. The creek dried up completely, forcing Sarah to walk 5 miles each day to find water. Their last chickens died, their cows stopped giving milk, and their garden became a patch of cracked earth where nothing would grow. Thomas disappeared for longer and longer periods, sometimes staying away for weeks at a time. When he returned, he was always empty-handed and angrier than before. Sarah began to suspect that Thomas was seeing other women during his absences. She found unfamiliar items in his saddlebags, caught whiffs of perfume on his clothes that definitely wasn't hers. The knowledge that he was not only abandoning her physically but betraying her emotionally as well felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She had given up everything to follow this man into the wilderness, and now he was throwing away what little they had left together. One morning in late summer, Sarah woke up feeling strangely sick to her stomach. At first, she thought it was just hunger or bad water, but as the days passed, the sickness came every morning like clockwork. With a mixture of joy and terror, she realized she was going to have a baby. The thought of bringing a child into their desperate situation filled her with panic. But it also gave her something to hope for again. Maybe a baby would change Thomas, would make him remember the man he used to be, would give them both a reason to fight for their future together. When Thomas returned from his latest absence 2 weeks later, Sarah told him the news with trembling hands and a hopeful heart. She expected him to be surprised, maybe even happy despite their circumstances. Instead, his face went pale with rage. He accused her of trying to trap him, of making their situation even worse than it already was. He said terrible things about the baby, about her, about their future together that Sarah couldn't bear to remember later. That night, Thomas got drunk and beat Sarah worse than he ever had before. She curled up on the floor of their cabin, protecting her belly with her arms while he kicked her and called her every awful name he could think of. When she woke up the next morning, Thomas was gone. So were his clothes, his guns, their last horse, and what little money they had hidden away. He had left her a note written in his sloppy handwriting that simply said he was going to California and she should go back to her people in Ohio. Sarah sat in her empty cabin and cried until she had no tears left. She was pregnant, alone, and broke in the middle of nowhere, with winter coming fast and no way to survive it. The nearest town was too far to walk in her condition, especially with no food or water for the journey. Her nearest neighbors probably didn't even know she existed, and she had no idea how to contact them anyway. For the first time since coming west, Sarah truly understood what it meant to be completely abandoned. As the days passed and her situation became more desperate, Sarah realized that Thomas hadn't just left her to fend for herself. He had left her to die. Without resources, without help, without any means of escape, she was as good as dead already. The man she had loved and trusted and followed to the ends of the earth had decided that she and their unborn child were simply too much trouble to keep around. He had thrown them away like broken tools that were no longer useful. But Sarah Thompson was stronger than Thomas Brennan had ever realized. As she sat in that empty cabin, feeling her baby move inside her belly, she made a decision that would save both their lives. She was not going to die just because the man she married had decided she should. She was going to survive, and she was going to make sure her child survived too, no matter what it took. Sarah spent her first week alone rationing the few supplies Thomas had left behind. She found some dried beans in a forgotten corner of their storage shed, a handful of potatoes that hadn't rotted yet, and enough flour for maybe 10 days if she was very careful. The well near their cabin still had a little water at the bottom, though she had to lower the bucket on a longer rope each day as the level dropped. She knew these supplies wouldn't last long, especially with winter approaching and her baby growing inside her. Every morning, Sarah climbed onto their cabin's roof to scan the horizon for any sign of help. She could see for miles across the flat prairie, but there was never anything except grass, wind, and the occasional hawk circling overhead. She tried to remember everything Thomas had told her about their neighbors, but he had been vague about directions and distances. She knew there were other settlers somewhere to the east, but she couldn't be sure if they were 5 miles away or 50. As her pregnancy progressed, Sarah felt herself growing weaker, despite her determination to survive. The morning sickness that had plagued her early on was replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. Her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame, while her belly grew rounder each day. She tried to keep working in the garden, pulling weeds and searching for anything edible, but she could only manage a few hours before she had to rest. One evening in early October, Sarah was sitting outside her cabin watching the sunset when she saw smoke rising from the eastern horizon. Her heart jumped with excitement, thinking it might be a signal from other settlers, but as she watched, the smoke grew thicker and darker. It wasn't a friendly campfire or a chimney from a distant cabin. Something was burning, something big, and Sarah feared it might be a grass fire heading her way. She spent that night watching from her roof, ready to grab her few belongings and run if the fire came closer. But by morning, the smoke had died down to a thin gray line that eventually disappeared completely. Sarah realized it had probably been a settler's cabin or barn, destroyed by accident or maybe by raiders. The thought that her nearest neighbors might have just lost everything, or worse, filled her with a new kind of despair. The next week brought the first serious cold snap of the season. Sarah woke up one morning to find ice on the water bucket and her breath visible in the cabin air. She had enough firewood to last maybe a month if she was very careful, but winter in Colorado could last 4 or 5 months. She spent her days gathering dried grass, buffalo chips, and anything else that would burn, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. The cold would kill her and her baby long before spring arrived. It was during one of these desperate wood-gathering trips that Sarah first saw the Cheyenne brave who would save her life. She was about a mile from her cabin, bent over picking up dried branches, when she heard the soft sound of hoofbeats behind her. She turned around slowly, her heart pounding, and saw a young Native American man sitting on a painted horse about 50 yards away. He was watching her with dark, curious eyes, neither threatening nor friendly, just observing. Sarah had heard terrible stories about Indian raids from other settlers, tales of kidnapping and violence that had made her sleep with a loaded rifle beside her bed. But this man didn't look dangerous. He appeared to be about her age, with long black hair and clothing made of buckskin and beads. His horse was beautiful, a pinto with white and brown patches that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Most importantly, he made no move to approach her or show any sign of aggression. They stared at each other across the prairie grass for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah's hands shook as she clutched her bundle of sticks, unsure whether to run or stay still. The brave tilted his head slightly, as if he was trying to figure out what she was doing so far from any settlement. Then, without a word, he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing over a small rise as silently as he had appeared. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the encounter. She wondered if the brave was part of a larger group, if he would return with others, if she was now in even more danger than before. But she also found herself thinking about the way he had looked at her. There had been something almost gentle in his expression, not the savage hatred she had been taught to expect from Native Americans. He had seemed more curious than anything else, perhaps even concerned about why a pregnant white woman was wandering alone on the prairie. 3 days later, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. She found fresh meat hanging from a tree near her cabin, wrapped in what looked like animal hide. At first, she was terrified, thinking it might be poisoned or some kind of trap. But her hunger eventually overcame her fear, and she examined the meat carefully. It was venison, cleanly butchered and still fresh. more food than she had seen in weeks. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but Sarah had a strong suspicion it had come from the Cheyenne brave she had encountered. Over the next several days, more gifts appeared around her cabin. Fresh water in animal skin containers when her well finally ran dry. Firewood stacked neatly by her door. Wild berries and nuts wrapped in leaves. Each time the gifts appeared while she was sleeping or working inside, left by someone who moved like a ghost across the prairie. Sarah never saw who was providing these life-saving supplies, but she began leaving small tokens of thanks beside her door. A piece of fabric, a few buttons, anything she could spare to show her gratitude. The weather continued to grow colder, and Sarah's pregnancy made it harder for her to move around. She was now clearly showing, her belly round and firm under her loose dress. The baby kicked strongly, especially at night when she was trying to sleep. She talked to the child constantly, telling it stories about its grandparents back in Ohio, singing lullabies her own mother had sung to her, promising it that they would both survive to see the spring. One morning in late October, Sarah woke up to find the Cheyenne brave sitting calmly on her front step. She saw him through her window and froze, unsure what to do. He wasn't looking toward the cabin, but was instead facing east, watching the sunrise with a peaceful expression. His horse was grazing nearby, and there was something so calm and non-threatening about the scene that Sarah's fear gradually faded into curiosity. She opened her door slowly and stepped outside, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders. The brave turned to look at her, and she saw that he was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 25. His face was strong and serious, but there was kindness in his dark eyes. He spoke to her in his own language, words she couldn't understand, but that sounded more like a greeting than a threat. Sarah placed her hand over her heart and then gestured toward him, hoping he would understand that she was trying to thank him. He nodded once and stood up, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life outdoors. From a small pouch at his side, he pulled out what looked like dried plants and roots, offering them to her with gestures that seemed to indicate she should make tea or medicine from them. As the days passed, the brave began visiting more regularly, always bringing something Sarah needed. Sometimes it was food, sometimes medicine made from plants she didn't recognize, sometimes just firewood or fresh water. He never tried to enter her cabin or make her feel threatened in any way. Instead, he seemed content to help from a distance, like a guardian angel who appeared whenever her situation became desperate. Sarah learned to watch for his visits and began preparing small gifts in return. She mended a tear in his clothing with careful stitches, offered him bread when she had flour to spare, and showed him the baby growing inside her belly. He seemed fascinated by her pregnancy, though whether from personal interest or simple curiosity about white people, she couldn't tell. His presence became a source of comfort rather than fear, the one bright spot in her increasingly difficult situation. But Sarah knew that even with his help, she wouldn't survive a full Colorado winter in her drafty cabin with no real supplies. The baby was due sometime in late winter or early spring, and she would need proper shelter, warmth, and medical help when the time came. She had no idea how to communicate these needs to the brave, or even if he would be willing to help with something so complicated. All she knew was that without him, she and her child would already be dead, frozen in the early snows that had begun to dust the prairie each morning. The first real snowstorm arrived in early November, howling across the prairie like a living thing determined to bury everything in its path. Sarah huddled in her cabin as wind drove snow through every crack in the walls, making the inside almost as cold as the outside. She burned every piece of wood she had, along with furniture she broke up for fuel, but the fire barely kept the worst of the cold at bay. By morning, snow had drifted 3 feet high against her door and she could barely push it open. When the storm finally passed, Sarah expected to find herself completely cut off from the outside world. Instead, she discovered that someone had dug a path from her door to the well and stacked fresh firewood against the side of her cabin. The Cheyenne brave had somehow worked through the blizzard to make sure she survived. When she looked more carefully, she found deer meat buried in the snow near her door, wrapped in hide to keep it fresh. The man was risking his own life to keep her alive, and Sarah felt overwhelmed by gratitude mixed with growing desperation. Her baby was now very active, kicking and turning inside her belly day and night. Sarah estimated she had maybe 3 months left before the birth, but she could feel herself growing weaker despite the brave's help. The cold was sapping her strength, and the stress of her situation was taking its toll. She had lost so much weight everywhere except her belly that her wedding ring slipped off her finger one day and disappeared into the snow. She didn't bother looking for it. One morning in mid-November, Sarah woke up to find the brave standing inside her cabin. She should have been terrified, but instead she felt only relief. She was too weak to get out of bed, too cold to do more than pull her thin blankets closer around her shoulders. The brave took one look at her condition and began speaking rapidly in his own language, gesturing toward the door and then toward her belly. Sarah didn't understand his words, but his meaning was clear. She couldn't stay here any longer. The brave spent the rest of that day moving around her cabin, gathering anything that might be useful and packing it into bundles. He wrapped Sarah in every blanket and piece of clothing she owned, then gently helped her outside to where his horse was waiting. The animal was bigger than she had realized, strong enough to carry 2 people, and had been fitted with warm furs and blankets to make the ride more comfortable. Sarah had never ridden a horse before, especially not in her pregnant condition, but she knew she had no choice. The brave helped her climb up behind him, then arranged the furs carefully around both of them. As they rode away from the cabin where she had suffered so much, Sarah felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She was leaving behind the last connection to her old life, but she was also moving toward hope for the first time in months. The journey took 3 days. With frequent stops to rest and warm up around small fires the brave built with practiced skill. Sarah learned that his name was something that sounded like Macoons, though she wasn't sure she was pronouncing it correctly. He was endlessly patient with her weakness and her fears, sharing his food and water without hesitation, keeping her warm through the cold nights when they slept under the stars. On the 2nd day, they were joined by 2 other Cheyenne riders, both older men who studied Sarah with curious but not unfriendly eyes. They spoke with Macoons in their own language, and Sarah caught the tone of what sounded like an argument or heated discussion. She worried that they disapproved of his decision to help her, but Macoons remained firm in whatever he was saying. Finally, the older men nodded and rode ahead, apparently accepting his choice. The Cheyenne winter camp was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined. Instead of the savage wilderness she had been taught to expect, she found a well-organized community of families living in warm, comfortable teepees. Children played in the snow while women worked on various tasks around cooking fires. Men tended to horses and equipment, preparing for winter hunts. Everyone stopped to stare at Sarah as Macoons led her through the camp, but their expressions showed curiosity rather than hostility. Macoons brought Sarah to a teepee on the edge of the camp, where an elderly Cheyenne woman waited with several younger women who appeared to be her daughters or daughters-in-law. The old woman examined Sarah carefully, feeling her belly and checking her overall condition while speaking rapidly to the others. Sarah understood none of their words, but their gentle touches and concerned expressions needed no translation. These women knew about pregnancy and childbirth, and they were going to take care of her. Over the following weeks, Sarah learned to live as part of the Cheyenne community. The language barrier made communication difficult at first, but gradually she picked up basic words and gestures that allowed her to express her needs and gratitude. The women taught her their way of preparing food, showed her how to work with the materials they used for clothing and tools, and most importantly, shared their knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth. The elderly woman, whose name sounded like Natona, became Sarah's primary caregiver and teacher. She prepared special teas that eased Sarah's discomfort, massaged her back when the baby's weight became difficult to bear, and explained through gestures and simple words what would happen when the time came for the birth. Sarah had been terrified of giving birth alone in her freezing cabin, but surrounded by these experienced women, she began to feel that she and her baby might actually survive. McCoons visited Sarah regularly, bringing small gifts and checking on her progress. Sarah learned that he was not married, unusual for a man of his age in Cheyenne society. Through the bits of English that some of the younger people spoke, she gathered that he was considered something of a loner, more comfortable on long hunting trips than in camp social activities. His decision to rescue her had apparently surprised everyone, including his own family. As winter deepened and Sarah's pregnancy neared its end, she began to understand how close to death she had actually come. The temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes, and blizzards raged for days at a time. Her flimsy cabin would never have protected her through weather like this, and she would certainly have died trying to give birth alone in such conditions. Thomas's abandonment had been a death sentence, but McCoons had intervened to save both her life and her baby's. In early February, Sarah's labor began during another fierce snowstorm. Natona and the other women moved quickly and efficiently, preparing the teepee with everything needed for the birth. They burned special herbs that filled the air with calming smoke, arranged soft furs for Sarah to lie on, and heated water and cloths for cleaning the baby. Through the long hours of labor, they took turns supporting Sarah, offering sips of herbal tea and encouraging her with words she felt rather than understood. Sarah's son was born just before dawn, healthy and strong despite everything his mother had endured. The women cleaned him carefully and wrapped him in the softest furs before placing him in Sarah's arms. As she looked down at his tiny red face and listened to his lusty cries, Sarah felt a joy so intense it made her weep. This child represented everything good that had come from her terrible journey west. He was proof that love and kindness could triumph over cruelty and abandonment. McCoons was the first man allowed to see the baby, entering the teepee with the reverent quiet of someone approaching something sacred. He studied the child's face for a long time, then spoke to Sarah in English words he had apparently been practicing. "Strong baby," he said carefully, "like his mother." Sarah realized in that moment that this man had not just saved her life out of simple charity. He had come to care for her, and now for her child, in a way that went deeper than duty or kindness. As spring arrived and Sarah regained her strength, she faced a difficult decision about her future. Some of the English-speaking members of the tribe told her about settlements to the east, where she could rejoin white society, find work, and raise her son among her own people. But Sarah also understood that she could stay with the Cheyenne if she chose, that McCoons was hoping she would remain and become his wife, that her son would grow up as part of this community that had saved them both. The choice wasn't easy, but as Sarah watched her son sleeping peacefully in his cradle of soft furs, surrounded by people who had shown her more genuine care than her own husband ever had, she knew what she wanted to do. Thomas Brennan had thrown away what he considered worthless, but the Cheyenne had recognized something worth saving. Sarah Thompson and her son were going to build their new life with people who understood the true value of love, loyalty, and family. When spring finally came to the Colorado prairie, it found Sarah Thompson transformed from an abandoned, dying woman into someone strong and hopeful. Her son grew healthy and happy, learning to speak both English and Cheyenne, loved by an entire community that had welcomed him as their own. And McCoons, the brave who had risked everything to save a stranger, found that his act of compassion had brought him the family he had always hoped for but never expected to find.